poetry is what you want and poetry is what you need, then we have got good news for you, because the poetry news can be your steed. What are you doing, Giraffester? I'm doing the poetry news. That's my job. Go on, sit on the shelf. You'll be fine. I do apologise, everyone. Welcome to the poetry news. I apologise for the giraffe hijack. This is still the news, and we do still have with us Arsene and Eddie. How are you doing, everyone? Are you well?
Oh my god.
What's up, Giraffe?
Hi, Giraffe. Also, Martin.
Oh yeah, Martin too. Yeah.
I'm the world's great. Watch his mouth. I'm the world's greatest poetry giraffe. Nice to meet you. Yeah. Anyway, enough of that. This is still the poetry news. How is everyone doing? Are you well?
We're doing well.
Doing great. How about you?
Yeah, doing really well, thanks. Yeah, nice to be back doing more news. I love a bit of poetry news. So yeah. Speaking of which, we have loads of cool poetry stuff coming up on the show today. We have Villanelles, we have photography and haiku, and we have losing a fear of poetry. But we start this week with Hannah's Bookshelf. Hannah's Bookshelf is a marvellous little poetry radio show that is broadcast every Saturday from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. on the UK-based North Manchester FM, and is also available around the world as a podcast. The show features in-depth interviews with poets and some really quirky and interesting and engaging segments like What Are You Reading? They're currently doing a Read a Rainbow segment, which is currently featuring yellow poetry books. They do the library at the end of days. They do the yearly live poetry special, and also a whole lot more besides. I was actually on the live poetry special a couple of years back, and Hannah is a fantastic, wonderful, warm, and super welcoming host. Again, these shows, they thrive on the participation from listeners. So although there aren't any submissions and things like that, you know, the more you give shows like this some love, the more you share them, the more you get the poetry gossip, then you never know, you might be invited on as a guest or live poetry special or something like that. So if you fancy a listen, head over to northmanchester.fm or hannahkate.net. And at this point, I'd like to ask Eddie and Arsene, do you know this show? You got any particular favourite poetry shows or podcasts? What do you think about this one?
I don't necessarily know this show, but it seems amazing. Like these quirky things. I love the idea of the rainbow thing. It's now they're doing yellow, but it's so cool. Like the way you can the ways you can go, the places you can go, even with all of the different things. Like, yes, let's do books that are yellow. That is so cool. And I would say that to answer your question, one of my favorite podcasts and poetry is called Spirits and Poetry. Yeah, it's the host himself. It's a very calm show. It talks about these really interesting ideas in poetry, including vibration, themes, tropes, mythology, even birth and reality, even the technical stuff like editing, analysis, etc. This is a really cool podcast that I hope we can talk about in another episode, and I wish you guys could listen to it. But also, let's go back to the show that you brought up, Martin. It's really cool. It sounds really cool.
I agree. It's really cool. I mean, this is the first time I've heard of it, but I love it. I think it's a great concept. I also love the rainbow theme, and I also love that they have a theme where it's only showcasing yellow books. That's pretty cool. If they ever want to showcase a mauve book, let me know. Also, I'm really bad, I guess. I guess I'm a bad poet that I don't really listen to that many poetry podcasts, but I am super addicted to Instagram, and I follow Button Poetry, Voices in Power, and I also look at the old Def Jam poetries a lot. I love watching. That's like my thing, I guess. So that's where I come in with that stuff.
There are so many people doing their poetry shows in whatever way they do them around the world, and it's it's wonderful when you discover something new like that. Everything's got its own flavor and its own spin and its own way it does things, and yeah, it's yeah, I'm definitely a fan of Hannah's Bookshelf, and maybe you will be too. So head over if you're interested to northmanchester.fm or hannahkate.net, and we'll be back right after this.
39 days, 20 people, wrong show. Hi, I'm Eddie. This is the Poetry News, and I'm joining you from Batoon, the north of Lebanon. And today, obviously, I'm a huge Survivor fan, so I had to do, so I'm bringing you a workshop on Villanelles, one of my favorite poems, which is Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas, is a villanelle, and villanelles in by themselves are amazing. It's this form of poetry that requires you repeating certain lines, that requires you that has to do with rhyme and meter and all that. It's a really cool form of poetry, and this workshop is called Villanelles, a workshop about villanelles, and it is part of the RQ Writing Academy collection, and it is hosted by Reading Queer. This workshop will take place on Saturday, April 9 at 7 p.m. GMT. About this workshop, and you will write about, let's hear it, villanelles. Yes, it's a villanelle workshop. You will spend the first part of your time together reading villanelles and discussing what makes them a successful use of the form, or what makes them, I read that. You'll also look at ways to apply your discussion to your own writing. The second half of the workshop will be spent workshopping a villanelle that you've already written. You will end by having a prompt to write a new villanelle. The workshop is hosted by Beth Gillis. I'm sorry if I mispronounce the name, who is a professor of creative writing at Georgia State University and an award-winning author of 4 books of poetry and 2 chapbooks. And also this workshop is hosted by Dustin Brookshire, who is a finalist of the 2021 Scotty Merle Award and is the founder and editor of the Limpress and the curator of the Wild and Precious Life series. So let me bring back my host and ask them, what do you think about this workshop, and what do you think about form still being used and talked about in our contemporary time, where form is really broken and free verse is what is looked for mostly?
So as someone who is an accidental poet, I'm still learning the different forms. Like you said, like in contemporary poetry, it's not really said that A, this is a villanelle, or B, this is a whatever, right? But I did some research on what villanelle is, and I realized that villanelles originally used to be rude, stop honking. Villanelles originally used to be like Italian and Spanish song form, which is really cool. Yeah. I thought so. I'm kind of excited. I would want to take this workshop just to see if I could do that, because I'm so used to free writing that I don't know. I like trying it out and seeing structure.
Well, absolutely, and I think first of all, I love the branding. Villanelles. Nobody is going to go to that workshop and be unclear as to what it's about. And I love a bit of clear branding. It's fantastic. Yeah. But also, I think, so just looking at my notes here, I think what the villanelle does really well, you talk about that really famous Dylan Thomas poem. With a villanelle, emphasizing certain lines and certain bits of the poem it's like a requirement of the form, and it's kind of like where, you know, a lot of like poems in the form da 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 A da 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 B, they'll often have like this little kind of refrain in them, and a lot of poems do, even freeform ones, to remind you of important things, the thing you're trying to emphasize. And the fact that a villanelle makes you do that makes you really think about, what am I really trying to say in this poem? And my other point on that, I know I've mentioned this on the show before, I find it really difficult to write in form. I generally kind of write in free form, but I also really enjoy the challenge of trying to do it. And so what I really want to do a lot more of is go to workshops like this and really push myself. And if I just write some rubbish Villanelles, at least I've conformed to the form, and at least that's a step. And my final point I'd forgotten to mention, I will mention. So I'm based in Nottingham in the UK. There's a really fantastic poet also based in Nottingham called Leanne Moden, who writes these wonderful form poems in forms that I've often never even heard of. So if you want to see some great modern form poetry, including Villanelles, check out Leanne Moden as well.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Arsen. And what I like regarding form, to build on what you said, Martin, is what I like doing sometimes is taking forms and breaking them down, be a bit modern with them. So instead of writing an actual villanelle, I would use something where you repeat the refrain a few times, it's like in a relay order, kind of like a villanelle does, or a sonnet that isn't actually a sonnet, but it's also a sonnet in its own way. So I like doing that, where you take a form and not necessarily stick to it, but challenge it a bit, play against it for a while. I like doing that in some of my poems. All right, thank you, guys, and we will be back with Arsen right after this. Stay with us.
Hello, and welcome back. It is I, Arsen, and Hachu! Did someone say haiku? Oh, yes, that's right, I did, because we are having a photography and haiku workshop on March 30th, 2 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. It's going to be organized by the one and only Stuart Wall of RPS, located in Cambridge, UK, and it's a discussion that will deep dive into the discussion whether photographs should have words with them outside of journalistic articles. It's a study which has deeply fascinated Stuart, who has been studying this in depth for years. Particularly, he is fascinated by haikus and by how haikus and photography affect each other, and therefore wanted to explore a deeper conversation about this, open to all to partake in virtually through the link that will be somewhere. With Ian Summers and his colleague Karen Hoy, or Hoy, I'm not sure. I apologize for the pronunciation of your last name, Karen, but you're a goat, Karen. Karen and Ian are both Western specialists in making haiku to talk to us about their life with haiku. So Alan is a former president of the United Haiku and Tanka Society, and between them, Alan and Karen run Call of the Page, which is dedicated to helping others develop their engagement with writing, words, and photography through the concept of shahai. They run courses throughout the year, and if you'd like to learn more about haiku and shahai, book your space at this event on March 30th at 7 p.m. UK time or 2 to 3:30 Eastern Standard Time with Alan and Karen. So, my dear friends, would you like to weigh in on this discussion to come? Or any thought on the event? Heralds, what do you think? Does photography work for or against words with them outside of the news? Anything? What you got?
Oh, well, it's something that I'd never really considered before until you brought it up and we were talking about it before the show. But it's something that I can see working really well. You know, often if you go to like an exhibit, a photography exhibit or something like that, you will see like a little caption under the photo. So why should that caption not be a haiku? It's just putting together the different art forms. It's it could totally work really well, and it's almost like a way of getting people into poetry without realizing that they're getting into poetry. In a sense, you know, they'll see it, they'll be like, oh, that's cool, no, that's cool, no, that's cool, and then they realize that they're just appreciating a poetry form, whereas you know, it's kind of like they've sort of almost like snuck it up on people in a sense, which I think is fantastic. And I think, yeah, the same way captions complement photos, you can do sort of haiku captions. And I just want to add as well, I love the idea that your job is haiku specialist.
Right?
I want to be a haiku specialist. That sounds amazing. You know, so
Right.
like fair play. You know, I huge respect for people who spend. You know, you said they'd spent years studying how haiku and photography affect each other, and that's just, you know, that's just amazing. You know, I want to be a haiku specialist too.
I would love that.
Right? Imagine that your title. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Two things. Martin, you just made a Survivor reference, and I thank you for that. The second thing, when you said fair play. Anyway, the second thing is this is really cool, and I believe that photography and poetry are complementary because they both try to capture a natural scene or a scene in the world. Any art form actually tries to capture a scene or an idea or a feeling or whatever it is, and poetry does all of that. So they are complementary. And I remember at uni, for example, this one year we had this poetry contest, and one of the categories was write a poem or submit a poem that has to do with a photograph or with a picture that you saw or with a painting that you have or something. So they are complementary, and I really love the idea of captioning, capturing captioning photographs or paintings or artwork with poetry, with haikus. That is really nice. That is a smart way to get people to read poetry without them knowing that they're reading poetry or evil. So yeah.
I'm definitely on board with you guys. I've always thought photography is a great way to inspire poetry, and poetry is a great way to inspire photography. So I don't really understand why there's a discussion about it, to be honest with you. Like, I mean, they're both can be appreciated individually as individual creative forms, and together they kind of create magic. So I don't really get it. But anyway, this would be a really cool discussion, especially from a haiku specialist or two. So definitely go ahead and check that out. Thank you, Heralds, for your input. And guys, yeah, so the link is again somewhere. So definitely click that. And thank you. That's it. That's all I got for you.
Good morning, good day, good evening. I am not Squigs, but we hope that Squigs will be back next week because Squigs is awesome. And if you're watching Squigs, know that. So we would like to bring to your attention an article, really interesting article that we found called Why I Used to Be Scared of Poetry But Can't Get Enough of It Now. And this is in the website Book Riot by Anne May Yi Jansen. And Anne May essentially talks about how when they were really young, sort of grammar school age, how they loved poetry, silly poems about dudes in bathtubs, nursery rhymes, that ridiculous red is for roses stuff, quoting from the article. And then goes on to talk about how poetry went from being fun to being irrelevant to their existence, and how the poetry they were reading made them feel unintelligent, made them feel that perhaps they weren't as smart as their peers, and essentially this sort of self-perpetuating cycle where the dislike of poetry sort of got connected with these bad things and essentially just grew and connected. That feeling that poetry, reading the likes of Tennyson and Whitman, just kind of felt irrelevant to them. But then the article goes on to talk about how they figured out why this was, and how, especially when they became a parent, how they rediscovered poetry and how they rediscovered talking about its simplicity and its beauty and how that was essentially contained in its brevity. So quoting from the article, I learned that poetry's power is in its brevity. While I almost always gravitate towards big, thick novels, poetry is slim and spare. It's quick if you want it to be. Years past, I read a lot of beautiful works by amazing poets like Joy Harjo, Maya Angelou, and Lawson Fuso-India. And they go on to mention more poets, and then they essentially talk about how they just read, often just say one poem at a time, and take a poetry book and just go through it one at a time, and essentially one poem maybe on a page can make them think for hours. And so I think this is a great example of how people, if they give poetry another chance a bit later in life, can really fall back in love with it. You know, personally, I went through a very similar story. When I was a kid, about 5 or 6, I had this book called Please, Mrs. Butler by, I think it was Alan Alberg. And I loved it. I read it over and over and over. And, you know, I also fell out of love with poetry and found the same kind of thing. I remember I think it was The Lady of Shalott, where we were reading in English, and some like 11 or 12-year-old, and it's kind of like, what's this woman aging super fast on a boat got to do with me being at school and things like that? And similar story for me, rediscovering especially a lot of punk poetry and beat poetry, and how sort of similar journey to get back into it. And I think a lot of poets might be the same. But I am going to ask Eddie and Arsene what they think, because I think I have rambled on enough. So Eddie, Arsene, what do you think about this?
I'm in the same boat as Anne, because they do mention something about poetry being elitist, and for the longest time it has been. Poetry is classified as this high culture thing. It's not popular culture. It's not something that everyone gets or everyone enjoys. And I get it. And part of why I enjoy it is, a very small part of it is this elitism to it. However, I was a person who was put aside, or who put poetry aside because of its elitist idea, until I discovered contemporary poetry, until I discovered poetry that has been written about things or by people who are similar to me, or about things that I have been experiencing, or poetry that has been performed, not just necessarily written to be difficult to understand. Performance poetry is usually because you have this, like, you just listen to the poem, and you need to, or you make sure, or you know that your audience is just listening to this poem just once, so they have to get the idea. This is what got me into poetry in the first place. It's the idea that now I can relate to a few poems, or to many poems actually, that makes sense. And I do understand the reason, or the idea, that these poems, let's say they mentioned Whitman and other poets. Even I was teaching Dickinson to my students, and they struggled to not understand necessarily, but also to relate, until luckily I'm young, I'm closer to their age, so like I was able to switch it, or to turn Dickinson's words into something that they can understand and they can relate to, and that's what I think brings people into poetry. Although now I do not handle when someone tells me that my poetry is relatable, but I get that this is what gets people into poetry, and this is what got me into poetry. So yeah, I totally agree with Anne.
I'm completely on the same boat as this article, and both of you guys. Like, I grew up on in my childhood, it was Dr. Seuss and Shel Silverstein who got me through grade school. I loved Shel Silverstein. And then in high school, they started introducing us to like Chaucer and like, what's his name? Like, this is what I mean. Like, I lost interest right away because I couldn't relate. Even Shakespeare, honestly, sorry, don't cancel me, please. But Shakespeare, honestly, I didn't relate to for a very long time. And I think relatability, even though like it's like weird that people say that about poetry, because you think of poetry, at least for me, I think of poetry, I think of person in like spectacles and a black turtleneck and smoking and just being like absolutely like the most elite and also like the most like deep person that I couldn't understand as someone who's not as deep ever, like type of scene. And to me, as a poet, that was a lot of the reason why I was intimidated to even perform, because I thought if I go into a poetry event, that's what I'm going to see, and I'm not like that at all. So, and thankfully, I'm proven completely wrong, and my zest for poetry has been completely changed because of that. And also, what was cool was when my teacher told me I'm a poet when she stole my diary from me when I was 16. I had a lot of rage, so I did a lot of ragey things, and then I also read Poe, and I was like, yes, this is my jam right now. And so she took my diary and she was like, oh, you're a great poet. And I was like, wait, so this is also poetry. It's not just Chaucer and all that. So yeah, I definitely agree with this article on so many levels.
Thank you both for your really interesting thoughts on that. And I think it's it's not like all classical poetry we dislike and all modern poetry we like not at all. It's about, like you say, it's about that relatability. And I think there's a lot of classical poetry that could be taught in schools that will retain somebody's interest in that. And I think changes are happening. So I know certainly in the UK, I Want to Be Yours by John Cooper Clarke is now taught as an example of poetry. And, that's something, you can get a lot more, like Let Me Be Your Electric Meter, I Will Not Run Out. I think especially as a sort of, all the hormones raging at school, I would have totally got that. But yeah, I think it's all about how poetry relates to you. But on a personal level, Chaucer can do one. But opinions expressed by Martin are not necessarily opinions expressed by all heralds. But anyway,
agree with Martin. What?
So we have quorum. Excellent. No, it's fantastic. So thank you, Arsene and Eddie, for your thoughts on that. Really interesting. So thank you, Eddie and Arsene, for your thoughts on that. And we'll be back right after this.
Thank you guys for watching us. Today I'm Eddie and this was Arsene and Martin. If you want to stay in touch with us, stay up to date with everything that we do, all of our shows, make sure that you follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the PGN Official, and on Facebook at Poetry Global Network. Also, if you want to tell us anything, send an email at the poetryglobalnetwork@gmail.com. Don't forget to hit that like button. Make sure to subscribe, share this video, and comment down below. What do you think about everything we talked about? It's a two-way discussion, you guys. Yeah. Arsene?
Yes. So we love making friends here. So you make sure to give us a comment down below. Give us a like, tap, heart, all those things that Eddie just mentioned. And thank you so much for joining us at another week of TPN. I gotta go. I got some pizza in the oven. See ya.